We're just gonna wait another couple minutes while we wait for attendees to arrive. While we're waiting, we are listening to Leeward Hughes, Emerald Glow, artist represented by Music Art People. Okay, so we are ready to get started. Okay, so if anyone was joining us in the first session of Artpreneur 2020 earlier this morning, we had a really great time and learned a lot. I just wanted to start by recognizing our conference partners, which includes Wallach's Art Supplies, Shifter Agency, and Invest Ottawa. And I'll also begin, for anyone that was not there in the first session, by introducing myself. Hello, bienvenue. My name is Alex Maltby, and I'm the program manager at Arts Network Ottawa. And Arts Network Ottawa and the City of Ottawa are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And Ottawa, and whichever city, town, or community you are tuning in from, is the home of Indigenous people, and they're the traditional stewards of this land. If you are participating from outside of Ottawa, and I know that there are some folks who are, we encourage you to share in the chat the traditional territory that you're viewing from, and also feel free to update your Zoom name in general, but also update to reflect this territory if you wish to put it there as well. Quick housekeeping. This time around, this wasn't working at 11 a.m. properly, but you should see in the upper left-hand part of your screen a bar, and if you follow this, you can open up a separate browser window that has live closed captioning. So if this is useful to you, please use this. It's unfortunately only in English. And while this session is offered in English, we welcome you to engage, share questions in the chat, in the Q&A in both English and French as well. For the Q&A and any sort of end of panel interactions, we will pull questions from the Q&A function. So we encourage you to use that, as well as the chat. And at the end, we will also ask you to raise your hand if you wish to actually speak, and we can unmute you to engage in sort of real life. Also, when you are using the chat, make sure that you have all attendees and panelists selected. So if you do intend to send a message to everyone in the room, it's not just coming to the panelists. And at the end, we'll encourage everyone to share perhaps their websites, social media links, or electronic business cards to try to recreate the networking experience that we're all missing out on from being in the room together at a more traditional type of a conference. We do plan to circulate this material afterwards, so if you do need to step away and come back, use the washroom, we want you to feel as comfortable as you are engaged and not feel like you're in a classroom at school. So please don't worry about missing out on content if you need to step away. And if you're disconnected or experience technical difficulties, you can email Madeline at artsnetottawa.ca, and we'll drop that in the chat if you have any issues there. I'll just, I rambled on a little bit in the first session, kind of reflecting on my experience in putting this conference together, but I wanted to just quickly share some of the things that I'm excited to explore in this particular keynote address, especially what, in this moment, what opportunities are there to develop more sustainable and equitable practices that we can hope to future-proof our creative sector. This time feels like a bizarre quilting point between technology, economics, culture, and models of artistic practice. And within this, what does it mean to be an artpreneur or an entrepreneur, or even just a professional during the pandemic, and in the eyes of institutions and arts institutions? And so what is the role of the artist? And to borrow a phrase from our keynote speaker, how did we get here and where do we see ourselves going? So before we explore these questions, I wanted to ask everyone in the audience, are you a creator or a business professional in the creative industries like film, television, music, digital media, or software? And do you find yourself lost navigating the legal complexities of working with others to create, protect, or buy and sell creative services? If you've answered yes to these questions, our keynote sponsor, Edwards Creative Law, is an excellent resource for you. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Byron Pascoe of Edwards Creative Law.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, as you mentioned, my name is Byron Pascoe. I'm an entertainment lawyer with the Ottawa-based law firm Edwards Creative Law. I appreciate being a part of this discussion about supporting artists. Since 2019, I've been heavily involved in a movement among arts lawyers to establish the national network of legal clinics for the arts here in Canada. We conducted the first national legal needs assessment of the arts and culture sector. We surveyed 1,150 Canadian artists, arts organizations, and legal experts in the sector. We found that 94% of artists feel strongly that they have a unique legal need and lack information and training on legal issues. Our report, entitled Now More Than Ever, Towards a National Network of Legal Clinics for the Arts, provides research on the multitude of legal challenges facing individuals working in the Canadian arts sector. This has been accelerated to critical levels due to the devastating impact of COVID-19. The report highlights gaps in legal needs, legal literacy, and education protections that are collectively taking dramatic tolls on a sector whose earnings were already near poverty levels prior to the pandemic. And we're now on phase 2 of our initiative with respect to programming and information and hubs across Canada. And I'm going to put some links in the chat where you can find out more information about what I think is a pretty exciting initiative. Before being on the executive for this initiative, for the prior 5 years, I was on the board of directors of Artist Legal Services Ottawa, which is one of the partner organizations of this national initiative. I encourage you to get to know them, and I'll put some links in the chat as well for them. Look forward to their next conference. In addition to Artpreneur, there are many opportunities in Ottawa for artists to engage with each other, gain knowledge and resources. And I've had the opportunity to be involved in 2 such organizations. Since 2014, I've been on the board of directors of Digital Arts Resource Center, which you may know from its former name of Saw Video, and maybe I'm telling you for the first time about the name change. I encourage you to visit DARC to apply for grants and learn about community projects and more. And since 2016, along with the Ottawa Music Industry Coalition, I've co-managed the Independent Music Business Series of free workshops for Ottawa's music community. And our next session's on Wednesday, December the 2nd at 7:30 about managing independent artists. I will also put that link in the chat. As an entertainment lawyer, my day job, my role is to advocate for the rights and entitlements of my artist clients. I focus on music, but also work with artists in all disciplines. I appreciate your time. Hope you enjoy this conference. Thank Alex and the organization team for all their hard work. I look forward to more conversations about supporting the arts community, including to ensure the rest of our country, from our neighbors to elected officials, support artists in meaningful and respectful ways that value the role of the artist. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker at Ottawa's Artpreneur 2020. Zainub Verjee is the laureate of the 2020 Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. Zainub has worn many hats and worked across different levels of government on issues of cultural policy, cultural planning, and cultural diplomacy. She's contributed to international and national policies and legislation pertaining to the culture sector, including the international instruments such as the status of the artists and cultural diversity. She continues to work on issues including artist labor, artist income, racial equity, cultural planning, intellectual property, digital ecosystems of art, cultural institutions, cultural diplomacy, and cultural trade. She's also an artist whose work has been shown both nationally and internationally, including at MoMA and Venice Biennale. We are honored to have her to be a part of Entrepreneur 2020 this afternoon. Zainub Verjee, welcome. We look forward to your keynote address.
Thank you for that great introduction, Byron, and for supporting artists in the way that you do. It's such great and important work. Bonjour, thanks to the Arts Network Ottawa, Réseau des Arts d'Ottawa, and Alex Maltby, which is why I'm here today. And we had a conversation which has brought me to this conference. And I want to thank all of those who have worked on the conference. It's a lot of work, but it looks like an exciting program, and I'm sure it's going to be really fantastic. So maybe we could start with the slide presentation, with the opening slide, if it's not already up. Thank you. So this conference is truly timely and engages, I think, with a really important issue of our times. And Alex said, and I'm going to quote, "With COVID-19 grinding the gig economy to a halt, this year's Artpreneur addresses the economic, social, and cultural disruption of the art sector in Ottawa and beyond," end quote. So in addressing the premise of this conference and the recovery, this keynote is really going to focus on how do we understand, unpack, reflect, and pivot on the political economy of the journey of the artist to artpreneur. And my presentation today is really going to present very much a macro picture. I think what we really need to account for in our current status and understand how we've arrived at this juncture and this crossroads. That's what we really need to understand. So I talk about the political economy, and what I mean by that is that it's the study of production, trade, and their relationship with the law and the government. It is also the study of how economic theories affect different socio-economic systems, along with the creation and implementation of public policy. Hence my title, Beyond Value Chains and Supply Chains, the Future of the Labor of Artists. Next slide, please. I actually wanted to call this, this keynote today, How the Pandemic Called the Bluff, but I think for now it's going to be the subtext for the presentation, and we'll come back to this. Next slide. Thank you. So the reading of the current moment in history points towards the shifts underway, which are clearly part of a larger cultural transition, invoking much more than just the arts. We're facing three crises: There's a public health crisis, or obviously it's the pandemic. There's a social crisis, which is the social upheaval. We've foregrounded by inquiry, which is foregrounded social movements across different sections of our society, such as Indigenous, the decolonization movements, Black Lives Matter, etc. And obviously there's the economic crises, and the precarity has really been accentuated by this pandemic. Things have come to the front in a way, to the front or to the fore in a very strong, profound way when we're feeling it. And then also beyond, and more importantly, beyond the three crises at this juncture, we're witnessing two key indicators. One is that 4 generations are living together, boomer to zoomer, and that there's been a breakdown of supply chains. And I think also through media and across multiple platforms, we see a narrative about our present condition and see how it's being built. Okay, the next slide, please. Thanks. So what is this narrative in the moment? On the one hand, we're continuously being told by leaders of the industry through their myriad spokespersons, AKA consultants, as to how there's no going back to the old ways. But what does that actually imply? Similarly, there's talk about the myth of the new normal. And then, of course, as you can see, there's what is life under a lockdown, and that's portrayed in this last quote, right? And what I'm pointing to here is how such historical moments generate a particular discourse across different modalities of institutions, disciplines, and community networks. Next slide. Let's try and understand this a little bit. There are, for example, 2 types of discourses that are very much at play: the socio-political discourse and the corporate management discourse. And here what I want to highlight is how in the current situation, it is not the socio-political leaders that are leading this. It's how and why the corporate business leaders have become more influential. And we see this manifestation at many levels and instances, be it philanthropy or social issues or politics. The public tends to listen to what the business leadership has to say. I think a really good example of this is during the COVID and the sort of social crises that we've seen in the last few months. For example, statements against systemic racism came out, and actually they began with the corporate bodies as part of their public relations. It was not long before everyone started following suit, and including the art world, and started putting out these statements. This was not being led by a socio-political discourse. It was very much being led by corporate and business discourse. Now, this has been going on for several decades. The genesis of the overbearing of business leadership on social issues stems from a very interesting moment in history, 1987. And what I'm alluding to is the invention of the diversity and inclusion apparatus by Rand Corporation's 1987 report, Workforce 2000. Some of you may know me, and you know that you've heard me speaking about this. Diversity and inclusion has nothing to do with racism or anti-racism. On the contrary, it's a productivity tool, and it really came about to address global labor. But the corporate discourse has embedded it into the systems to mean and imply something that it is not. And what does this result in? My observation is that the deeper the crises, the stronger the tendency among apologists of the system towards self-delusion or denial. This self-delusion is often structured in the binary of problem and solution, wherein to any challenge, the retort is, We need a solution. What is your solution? Find a solution. This state of denial is a characteristic feature of dominant ideologies, may be indispensable in the effort to restore hegemony, but it also runs the risk of leaving the ideology exposed, particularly when its own diktats seem to compound the crisis rather than resolve it. Here, I'm directly implying the embeddedness of neoliberalism into our systems. It is the same strident self-delusion can be seen in the arts, in culture, in education, in social welfare. Neoliberal assumptions about their role in the economy not only offer no plausible solutions, either social, political, or educational, to the present crises, but also involve a deeply demeaning view of the role of individuals in society. Next slide. So this makes me pose the question, have artists embraced a narrative about themselves, the one I've just told you about, and if so, why? And what does it tell us about the current state of the arts? Next slide. Let's try and unpack this question a little bit further. As you can see on this slide, there are three phases of the journey of the artist to becoming creatives. And I think we really need to understand and comprehend this journey because it tells us more about the political economy of our sector. We see how in the first phase, the making of the artist as a professional. This happens in the 60s and 50s to the 70s. In the second phase, we see the making of the artist as an entrepreneur. And then lastly, it actually gets reduced to the idea of creatives. And each of these phases represents a distinct shift in the political economy. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail. Next slide. So here you can have some milestones, and what you're able to see is the transitioning role of artists and its political economy. From the post-war period to 1970s, what we have is a clear indication of how artists, through the process of becoming institutionalized or the institutionalization, were turned into professionals, and with the stated attempt to make them part of the middle class. The Massey Report of 1951 establishes, in fact, the very architecture of what Canadian culture should be, and it lays out the institutional process. You get the formation of the Canada Council for the Arts, the CBC, the archives, art galleries and museums are founded, funding is put into that building of that infrastructure, and many other things. And of course, this whole idea of the Canadian contact. The 1970s to 1990s is the period of the onset and establishment of neoliberalism. In simple terms, the market becomes the champion through free trade, and culture becomes one of the commodities to be traded. I know this, I said this in one simple sentence, but this process was not as simple, and it really saw many upheavals. And there might be people today listening, but I definitely, and who were listening and were part of this, but I was very much involved during these decades in many of the debates and contestations, to protect the interest and the rights of artists during this. And also new ideas like managerialism and the supply chain were introduced. In a decolonizing world during the times of Thatcher and Reagan, it did not take much time to reach what is known as the Washington Consensus. Now, the Washington Consensus was nothing but a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions which created a reform package for the crisis-ridden Third World, supervised by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the US Department of Treasury. In ordinary language and simple language, this was the moment when the idea of exporting labor to the Third World, understood as outsourcing, and importing finished goods into the country Think of Walmart, of things made in Bangladesh, or the iPhone, Apple phone made in China. It was arrived at because it was more profitable as a business proposition. And then between 1997 and 99, the new Labour Party under Tony Blair in the United Kingdom completely commodified the idea of culture. First, he changed the name of the Department of Culture, Media and Sports. Now it's called the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sports. And it was actually this move that led to the institutionalization of the creative economy. And it became the template. And then the third followed, the Pied Piper, Richard Florida. And in this country, mayors and politicians and government blindly embracing the creative economy because it addressed their political expediency. So culture was divided into 13 sectors, from 13 sectors to 22 sectors, depending on who you followed. And by 2009, UNESCO introduced the business idea of the value chain for the culture sector and concomitant value chain analysis. And I'll quote, "The value chain analysis is essentially a tool that lets policymakers, project managers, or cultural entrepreneurs gain an understanding of the causes for market underperformance by identifying the reasons for market failure." And so you can see that the focus was only market, it was not artist. And in the last 2 decades, we see IT joining hands with the market, right? Making it the winner takes all model. And this cycle basically completes the death of the artist. Next slide, please. Thank you. William Deresiewicz has precisely written on this new paradigm of the digital age, one that is changing our fundamental ideas about the nature of art and the role of artists in society. And how what he points to is how we're really embedded in an IT and market paradigm, which is dictating the terms of how we will work and live, in fact. And you can see the image of the book on this slide. And I think he relates 2 narratives that are really symptomatic of the deeper shifts that have occurred. The first is the Silicon Valley boosterism. And basically it says that there's never been a better time to be an artist. Anyone can easily market. And we see this being spun as creators who got tired of waiting to be chosen, took to the web and saw their work go viral. The artist's tale is different. Everyone can produce and post your work. As a result, we may now have universal access to the audience, but at the price of universal impoverishment. Left to fend for themselves in the marketplace, artists have been forced to practice creative entrepreneurship with less time to spend building an oeuvre or perfecting the technique, and more time to be spent on networking and self-promoting. User reviews and recommendation engines matter more to them than critical opinion. Their work tends to be tamer, safer, more formulaic, more like entertainment, maybe less like art. And even Deresiewicz contends that even very, very moderately successful artists often struggle. In the 1980s, 80% of music album revenue went to the top 20% of content. Now it goes to the top 1%. And you can see the shift, what that means. Among other things, he observes like how the current model works. And the only way, and he says, the quote, "The only way the current model works is if you are young, healthy, and childless. This is a typical neoliberal construction of the productive individual." Next slide. Thank you. So I want to just spend a little bit time following from that on this work, labor, and jobs. And what I believe are witnessing now is a political segregation of work, labor, and jobs. And work is an intended activity that is accomplished through free will. Labor is to produce goods and services in an economy, and its stratification is based on abilities, whether it's skilled or unskilled or professional. And jobs can be willed, managed, and or measured. Next slide. At the core of entrepreneurial societies, we're looking at how to generate sustained and sustainable economic growth built on high value, well-paying jobs. Next slide. And I think this really kind of shows how labor was outsourced and became part of the globalization and supply chain. And as I mentioned earlier, Derezowitz points out that IT and market consolidation really resulted in the nature of precarious jobs that we know today, you know, call it by any name, gigs, self-employment, creative. We know the names, we use them, and we're part of it. We've become part of it. We've been pushed into this globalization and market-driven economy, political economy. Next. So I spent a little while, you know, really trying to explain through the relationship between work, labor, and jobs. And that the present focus on jobs and how the current political discourse is situating the idea of work. So under the umbrella of reform, and there's lots of buzzwords like innovation, for example, and its exigencies have tapered even more finely to the perceived needs of the labor market. Similarly, the skills development agenda is another buzzword for neoliberalism. Have you noticed how pervasive this agenda is and how tightly controlled it is, for example? And you can see this prevalence, right, from the funding of community art projects to the education sector. The skills learning outcomes model has become a uniform point of reference for a cluster of other management-driven concepts which have contributed in the neoliberal era to the transformation of the landscape of the culture, social, and education sectors. And I think the most critical impact has been on the political segregation of this tripartite division, work, labor, jobs. And the current politics is really driven by the concept of jobs while work is being left out. And this is actually what has a direct impact on the idea of work of artists. And we've lost agency. We've really lost our agency. Next slide. So today, this world of labor looks, and I've said this many times, but it looks a lot like the way art labor looked for decades. Do you know that artists earn 43% less than general labor? The status of the Artist Declaration has asked the signatory governments to offer artists equal status and footing with other professionals in the labor market. And Canada's artists have experienced similar exclusions as farm workers, migrant workers, and domestic workers in the labor law. This is serious, folks. Next slide. Now, during COVID-19, I've been writing on these issues, and particularly as they matter to the arts, and especially from the policy and systemic perspective. You know, on May 15th, I wrote on a 40-year-old issue in the Georgia Strait on the status of the artist, and as you can see from the screenshot, but you may ask, what is the status of the artist? Many people don't know, actually. It was a UNESCO declaration made in 1980, to which Canada is a signatory, and it addresses the social and economic status of the artist, primarily the centrality of artists in society, the atypical nature of work, that artists do, and hence the issue of income associated with it. And these are the core tenets of the status of the artist, which informs the governance of any legislation pertaining to artists' labor and income. But let's see what the state of artists is today. And you must be wondering, like, what is this path to recovery? Next slide, please. This is the question that we have to ask and respond to, right? How can you regain your agency? How will this happen? So basic income actually is a way out, politically, economically, and socially. But on a broader note, what we're now noticing is a political separation, as I said, right, between the work, labor, jobs/employment. Today, the idea of welfare is connected to the labor market, which looks obsolete. And if I may invoke here Hannah Arendt, the notion of vita activa as elaborated in The Human Condition, and it is critical for everyone. Basically, in simple terms, it is about action. You need to take political action for change to occur. You need to go and demand basic income. The individual as the neoliberal self and as part of human capital, and what you've become is the part of this making of the human capital is the skills development, which is really a neoliberal agenda pushed through governments and their agencies. And we need to reconfigure these relationships between individuals and institutions. And this can only be built through literacy and awareness. For example, to fight labor rights, it's not skills training. You don't need skills training to fight for labor rights. To resist, and resistance is not about skills training. But what we need to do, we need to build literacy. We need to be aware of our rights. We know what our history is. And we need to fight for our stake in shaping the future. And this really calls for realizing one's agency. And to activate that agency requires enormous moral courage. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Why basic income? Why is this so important for us to be focused on this now? Because it is the response to break free from the neoliberal concepts of value chains and supply chains. Why? Also because basic income is the response to failure of welfare tied to the labor market. It is only through these kind of actions that appropriate primacy to the idea of work and labor will be attributed, and you will be able to realize your dignity. So it's important, this movement and the campaign. And I think the three takeaways that I propose, which are: be accountable, understand your history, do not fall for myopic appropriated narratives of the issue, seek clarity, get the information that you need, build your moral courage, regain your agency. And this is all to regain the rightful place of work. Basic income is a way out, politically, economically, and socially. The next slide. So there's lots of work going on. As you know, there's the Ontario Basic Income Network group. There's recently several things that have emerged, and lots of groups have done different things. There's also one led by Media Arts Network of Ontario, and there's a group that's come together under it also for the campaign for basic income. So there's different ways that you can participate, but be accountable, find your moral courage and agency, and let's make the change. I want to say that the biggest takeaway from this keynote is the need to really interrogate every aspect of working together rather than defaulting to how things were done pre-COVID-19. This is a moment, as your conference or this conference says, this is the moment to be disruptive. we have the opportunity in such a huge way to really change how things are. We're definitely going to face uncertainty, ongoing certainty, and the imperative to navigate this extended period of turbulence we encounter was really going to call for action, and we have this opportunity to disrupt. So if you can just go to the next slide. I want to thank you all for listening today. I hope that you understood what this bluff was that I referred to earlier. The question confronting us really is, how can we disrupt? How can we pivot from this moment in history? And we can do it. We really can. So I'll stop there. And thank you everyone for being here today and joining me, and especially to Alex and Arts Network Ontario and Byron for sponsoring.
Thank you. That was very thought-provoking, I know, for myself. We have some time for a Q&A, and so everyone in the room is welcome to either use the Q&A function at the bottom panel of their screen. I'm sure there's a lot of questions once we digest some of this. And then if you actually want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. I just had a question to start this off, and this goes to both Zainub and all the participants in the room as well. So my initial thoughts are, in reading some of the work that you've produced on the legacy of the Massey Report and your comments on the way we institutionalize or use this neoliberal diversity and inclusion corporate approach that never fully impacts the actual system because it exists within the ideology of the system itself as a sort of creates this false consciousness effect. And it reminds me a bit about ecology movements and climate change movements. And the quote that I think it's Walter Benjamin, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And now that the world kind of is ending or feels like we've reached a point where this is happening, how do you feel like we're in a better place to overturn some of these systems in meaningful ways? And I think UBI is one example, but what other transformations do you hope to see in the upcoming year or years once this literacy has hypothetically been raised? And so this also goes out to everyone else that's listening, and I'm curious about everyone's thoughts on that as well.
Thanks, Alex. You make a really good point. I mean, I really do feel, we're so conditioned to fall into a particular space and only think about the world that we live on in a particular way. But because this crisis, the pandemic has brought all these crises to the forefront, I think we really have seen that it's a time to pause and reflect and really come together like you're doing in this forum, bringing people together to ask the hard questions, to be very self-critical, right? And to go, how can we actually change things? And one of the reasons that basic income has come back, right? It's not a new concept in Canada, or it's been introduced in other parts of the world, is because this is the right moment for that kind of disruption, right? And we really need to move away from, the 70s was full of the group think, right, idea, and we kind of fall into those. But can we be critical of our use of social media, right? Can we be critical of the system that we live in? How can we have more forums like this or more training, to really kind of break through, what's happened? Because people go, well, we want to kind of recover, right? But we don't want to recover to the to what we were before COVID. We need to get far beyond that. We literally cannot, and we need to think about what is work for an artist, right? Because that work is not, it's not what the creative is, right? The creative is deeply embedded into the market system. In order for us to regain our agency and our dignity and to really do work, we need to find that space. And I think basic income is going to give us that breathing space to think, to reflect, to pause, to make our work, but also to think, how we can come together socially and politically again.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Patrick in the Q&A that starts by saying, thank you for an excellent presentation. Can you clarify if artists' agency is best utilized to move towards asserting our place within the new neoliberal context, or should we concentrate on defeating the entire neoliberal agenda?
I love this question. I think that the thing is that agency has actually been eaten away by neoliberals, right? That's why we don't have those moments where we can gain our agency back. So if there's something that we can come together on, right, that will allow you to feel that space and agency again, to try and disrupt the system, right? So that's what we need to really focus on. I think we need the moral courage, and we need to find the place to gain that agency back, because literally what neoliberalism has done is completely ripped it out of us, so that we're not able to really do anything, right? And that's why I spoke and showed about that segregation of work, labor, and jobs, right? And how that sort of separation has occurred within the political economy. And so yeah, that's what we need to gain back. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Okay, and just a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question verbally, just to use the raise hand function, and we can unmute you as well to engage in a way that is not just through text. So there's another question. What is your take on philanthropy in the arts, both in terms of its structural impact and its impact on artists?
I think philanthropy also has become very neoliberalized, right? I mean, if you just look at the boards of cultural institutions, for example, and how they've been integrated into that. And now there's been also huge issues around that, right? As we've looked at, some challenges within that as well, right? I think that the tax cuts, Reagan's tax cuts, really changed the arts ecosystem, right? And so I think that also philanthropy is really interesting in different ways, because we're looking at who's giving you money for what, and what is it that you are really supposed to be bought into in order to get that money. And I think these are huge issues. I mean, I think, for example, it's interesting, while the art world, for example, really wants to deal with systemic racism, right, and try and address those issues, all the dollars it gets is actually not in supportive of that, for example, right? They are not bought into that. So I think the idea of philanthropies is also quite, it's a big topic, right? Because it's technocratic board members, it's about efficiency, it's about sort of those, public-private partnerships. It's literally all like those, it's a very neoliberalized space in which this occurs.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if anyone has any other questions or, okay, there is something from Sean. So I will allow Sean to unmute.
Am I heard?
Yes, go ahead.
I was starting to write this out, but it's probably a lot easier to speak. I used to be in support of a universal basic income, but I've come to grow skeptical of the model. Neoliberal actors are some of its principal proponents. I believe that it can lead to the erosion of the welfare state via the commodification of social program provision and delivery. At the same time, I recognize that the arts community would be a principal beneficiary of such a public policy. And so my question is how we as a community can ultimately advocate for such a thing while, I don't know if it's mobilizing or if it's effectively while coming together to resist the downstream effects of this being implemented by a capitalist state, you know, in terms of like, once the money's there, well, let's get rid of certain health, education, social program.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that there's really like a spectrum of views around this, and there's different understandings about it. So basic income guarantee is what we are speaking about, right? Which is not the same as universal basic income. I think there's differences in what people understand when you say UBI, or there's different definitions, terminology. There's semantics issues. Sorry, is what I'm trying to say. But basic income guarantee is actually, you know, it's not means tested at all, right? It's like everyone should be able to get a basic income guarantee. Establishing a certain income level is going to be really important, and so I think that that's where perhaps the difference lies, is that there's several different terms being used and spectrum of views on this, but we're looking at really, you know, a basic income guarantee which is not means tested.
Okay, Emmanuel has raised a hand, so I will allow Emmanuel to unmute.
Hi there. Thanks so much for a clear and enlightening talk. I was also typing something out, but I'm just going to speak instead. One of the many points that resonated very, very deeply that you made is about how in this trajectory you've described, artists have been driven to focus more and more on promotion and networking, leaving less time and focus on developing craft and developing practice more generally. Yet I feel like there is a certain promise in this democratization of art making tools and art making principles that we've witnessed over these decades. And I'm just trying to wrestle with that, because I feel like in the communities that the organization where I work serves, there is still a very major emphasis on this distinction around the professional artist, and I'm just wondering if this term of professional artist, as opposed to hobbyist, you know, if that is a dichotomy worth keeping, or if we also have to consign that as another vestige of a neoliberal framing of all this.
Sorry, yeah, thank you, Emmanuel, for that. That's a really good question, and I think when I'm referring to the professionalization, it's coming out of, you know, how our work got institutionalized in particular kinds of ways, which you understood, you know. I think we need to look at this across the whole sort of continuum from hobbies to cultural industries, right? I mean, you and I work in a sector that's very much part of that professionalization that I spoke about. But I think that this critique, you know, these shifts of work to labor, labor to jobs is actually needs to be applied across the continuum from hobbyist, amateur artists, emerging, professional, you know, etc., all the way to the cultural industries. And I think that's an interesting question and something that we need to maybe engage more on and understand how that would work or how we can talk about it, right? Because the Massey Levesque Commission, actually, that's where the struggle occurs. And I know there's people on the panel in the audience who work towards this. It actually removes the community out, right? Its focus becomes really on the professional, right? Which is where you and I, this is the ecosystem that you and I work in, for example. So I think that there needs to be a really, you know, overhaul. We literally need to overhaul the system, and the rewriting of some of these policy documents is actually what needs to happen, right?
Okay, well, oh, there are some more questions in the Q&A. Sorry, I missed those. How would basic income for artists change how art is shared with the consumer/observer? Will there still be monetary incentives for performance?
That's a good question. I mean, basic income from artists will change how you can make your work, how much time you can put towards your work. But I don't have the answer to that very specifically in terms of how all that would work out. But these are all things that we need to be engaged in and be thinking through, because we need to, you know, make sure it's working for us, and we have to make sure that somebody else isn't going to make the decision for us within the system. This is the time to disrupt. But we have a lot of you know, we are going to have to create the spaces for us to come together to have these conversations, to work out those things, like this conference is doing.
Right, and there's one last question that I have on file. In your view, what will the significant threats and opportunities in the process to establish UBI within the neoliberal world? I'm assuming there's a B somewhere. What will the threats and opportunities in this process be?
You know, I think a significant threat could be that we don't understand deeply enough what the issue is, that we don't understand the separation, the segregation that I talked about, and that we are not able to gain our moral courage and agency to push for this change. I think that to me reads like a significant threat. If we are unable to come together in solidarity, old-fashioned word, you know, it's been kicked out. We don't hear these words anymore, right? We don't hear this terminology. We need to come back in solidarity as artists, working together and figure this stuff out. And I think the biggest threat will be our inability to gain agency and the moral courage to do so and to really push for this, for example. That's what I can say. That's how I feel anyway, very strongly.
Okay, well, it appears that that's it for now. I think that this is a conversation that can and will continue until, you know, meaningful changes occur. So I just wanted to thank Zainub and thank Byron at Edwards Creative Law for being here, and maybe just in these last few minutes, if there's anyone that wanted to share their contact information, or was hoping to engage with other folks who are here to watch the session, you're welcome to share in the chat, and we can share any resources and links that were included in the chat around for everyone after the fact. So we do have one more session today at 3 o'clock, so I hope to see everyone there. And again, thank you very much to Zainub for this contribution today.
No, thank you, Alex and Byron, and everybody who attended, and all of you. Thank you. I hope that we can continue this conversation and actually push for the change that we all want, right? To retain our dignity.
Okay, so we will be using the same link for the entire day. So we're going to shut this one down. And then if you are returning at 3 o'clock for the panel with Music Art People, you just follow the same link and we will let you in. So thanks again, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And
Take
see
care.
you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.